very much. So our next speaker, Stephen Nissenbaum, is the professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst History Department, where he has written several landmark books in early American history. He was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, a fellow in the National Endowment for the Humanities. Professor Nissenbaum is perhaps best known for his Salem Possessed with Paul Boyer, which profoundly shaped how we understand the Salem witch trials. And then as well, he's also equally well known for The Battle for Christmas, one of my all-time personal favorite history books, which examines the development of a distinctly American set of Christmas traditions in the early 19th century. And so Stephen is here today to speak with us about a way in which the events surrounding 1820 perhaps unexpectedly dealt with that phenomenon. I will turn it over to him. Welcome.
Hi. Yes, thank you. My talk, like Ashley's, is going to be about both America and England, but it's going to show another side, both of their past and their present. I suggest perhaps that American society was in 1820 really up for grabs. I'll begin. You're looking at a picture of Washington Irving, a New Yorker by birth and upbringing, who was the first American author to achieve international renown. He became famous by writing a set of 33 sketches that were published in both America and England in 6 installments during 1819 and 1820. The portrait that you're looking at now, I just realized, is a signification of his success, that he finally had a beautiful formal portrait made of him. Today, the most famous of the 33 sketches are The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the even better known Rip Van Winkle. You can turn this off. Fine. But at the time, the most popular of the sketches was a series of 5 interconnected pieces about the celebration of Christmas in a British country manner. Bracebridge Hall, a representation of which you're looking at. It's, of course, fictional. The 5 sketches were printed together as a single installment that appeared precisely, deliberately so, during the Christmas season on January 1st, 1820, when Maine was then in its final weeks as a part of Massachusetts. In these sketches, Irving, which is to say his narrator, is hosted at Christmas by the owner of the manor, old Squire Bracebridge. Can get me that now? Old Squire Bracebridge is an antiquarian-minded country gentleman, a real gentleman, went to Oxford, who's obsessed with, quote, the holiday customs and rural games of former times, and who has recruited the local peasantry to join him in reenacting those customs. On Christmas Day, Squire Bracebridge presents a lavish banquet. Next slide. A lavish banquet at which he displays, along with plentiful beef and ale, all the old rituals of the season, including a wassail bowl, a Yule log, and what you're looking at now, a boar's head on a platter. The squire has also invited a large group of peasants, many of them his own tenants, to participate. They first gather outside the hall, and among them, we'll get to this again later, is a smaller group who perform what Irving calls a curious old dance. More about that later. The peasants are then invited into the manor house. Next slide, please. Where they mingle easily with the squire's real guests. For Irving's narrator, the banquet is a triumph. he waxes eloquent about the scene, which, as he tells us, seemed to throw open every door, to unlock every heart. It brought the peasant and the peer together and blended all ranks in one warm, generous flow of joy and kindness. And he goes on, there is something, by making a larger point, there is something genuine and affectionate in the gaiety of the lower orders when it is excited by the bounty and familiarity of those above them. The warm glow of gratitude enters into their mirth, and a kind word and a small pleasantry frankly uttered by a patron gladdens the heart of the dependent more than oil and wine. Irving's Christmas sketches proved wildly popular in both England and America, more popular than, say, Rip Van Winkle at the time. And Irving quickly capitalized on their popularity, I guess by having a portrait painted, but also by writing another full-length book of sketches about life in that same country manner, published only a year later and titled simply Bracebridge Hall. This is to suggest the popularity of these Christmas sketches, which were so influential that even now we remain indebted to them for much of the imagery that we associate with the traditional old-time Christmas, bountiful, festive, hearty, but always decorous, never transgressing the ultimate bounds of propriety, never sliding into vulgarity or rowdiness. Vulgarity or rowdiness, it's on that point, historically speaking, that Washington Irving's sketch was at its most misleading. Next slide. One of the first things I learned when I was researching the history of Christmas was that for most people, those of the, quote, lower orders especially, the season offered a rare opportunity to let go, to let loose, to be released for a brief time from the inhibitions and restraints that bound them the rest of the year. Examples of this are plentiful, and my book includes a lot of them. At the risk of making too abrupt a transition here, let me read you just a couple of descriptions, just a couple of many, many, many. Here's the Reverend Cotton Mather, Salem witch trials guy, the Reverend Cotton Mather of Boston, writing about Christmas in 1712, quote, "The feast of Christ's nativity is spent in reveling, dicing, carting, masking, and in all licentious liberty, by hard drinking, by lewd gambling, and by rude reveling." Second one, the Reverend Henry Bourne, who is an English clergyman, not a Puritan, writing in 1725, where he says that the behavior of the common people at Christmas is, quote, "a scandal to religion and an encouraging of wickedness, merely a pretense for drunkenness and rioting and wantonness." That's sex again. Finally, here's, and I'll take off from this one, here's a 1786 report from upstate New York. You can turn the slide off, Ashley, if you wish. In this 1786 newspaper report goes like this: "In a few churches, divine service was performed on Christmas." But then the report continues, "The temples dedicated to the service of merriment, dissipation, and folly were much more crowded, where the sons of gluttony and drunkenness satiate their appetites." The report concludes by specifying what happens next. At about midnight, the report goes on, at about midnight, they sallied forth into the streets and by their unmeaning, wild, extravagant noise, disturbed those citizens who would rather sleep than get drunk. That report hints at something else, I think, that by making all those wild noises, these drunken bands of plebeians may actually have not just been letting off steam, but also they might have been addressing the would-be sleepers. In other words, that they deliberately paraded through the streets of what was likely an upscale part of town with the intention of creating a disturbance, of awakening them. Next slide, please. In that case, their behavior would have constituted what historians have named street theater, a performance played in public to a real life audience, but an unwilling one. I say this because of something else I learned early on in my Christmas research. The rowdiness that so often characterized this kind of behavior did not signify sheer or mere chaos. Rather, it constituted a well-understood seasonal ritual, well understood by both classes. And that ritual was designed to provoke an aura of what I'm going to call social inversion, a state in which the mutual relationship of the classes is symbolically turned upside down. The rich and the poor, in a direct face-to-face exchange, ritually reverse their respective roles. This ritualized inversion would, of course, be instigated by the poor who had the most to gain, but it was also understood by the rich who were obliged, given the season, to acquiesce in it. Thus, when a band of plebeians approached the manor house, the gentry within had to serve them, to wait upon them, to offer them gifts, the gifts they asked for. What they usually asked for was alcohol, food, good food, and or money. One common term for this ritual remains in use today, though with quite a different meaning. The term is wassailing. Next slide, please. I'm now showing you the first of a series of 4 slides, each of them containing a chunk, a different chunk of one New Year's wassail from Northern Scotland. In this first slide, we see the usual demands for the best beer, for the best food. Sometimes, next slide, please. Next slide. Yes. Sometimes they even ask for sex. It's hard to say what that really meant, but it was a part of many of the wassails. I remember here Cotton Mather's words about rude reveling and licentious liberty. The rest of the year, of course, back to normal times, it was the poor who were obliged to serve the rich. The ritual inversion of that system at Christmas time was initiated by some sort of performance, almost always, I think. A performance given outside the doors of the rich, but often demanding to be let in. The performance would always involve an element of aggressive begging, a demand for gifts. And if this demand was satisfactorily met, the band of beggars would depart. Next slide, please. They would depart, but not before or offering something of value in return, a token of their goodwill. This part of the wassail social inversion ritual is what we ordinarily think of today when we think of a wassail song. We wish you this, we wish you prosperity, all your crops, all your animals, we'll eat better next year too in that case. So an expression of hearty gratitude, best wishes for prosperity in the new year, and with it, they departed with the tacit promise that when the holidays were over, they would willingly resume their ordinary roles. After all, even a curmudgeonly landed gentleman could always use a generous handout at Christmas as a bribe to keep his dependents in order for the rest of the year. To ward off the possibility that wealthy patrons might fail to meet the demand, the beggar's performance might contain a tacit threat, a threat that they might withhold their goodwill, or even the overt threat that they were prepared to do immediate harm right then and there by damaging property or even people. Next slide, please. The last of the 4. The same Scottish wassail contains exactly that kind of threat. It's New Year's Eve and night. We've come here to claim our right. It's the morning, it is New Year's Day. We've come here to sport and play. And if you don't open up your door, we'll lay it flat upon the floor. A hint of the begging part of this kind of performance can actually be found back in Washington Irving's Christmas sketches. without any threats accompanying it, of course. Next slide, please. Remember that before Squire Bracebridge's peasants were invited into his hall, a group of them performed a curious old dance, a curious and intricate dance. Irving reports, in referring to this, that one of the dancers kept, in his words, capering around the edges of the group. You're looking at him now. Rattling, and as he did so, he kept rattling a Christmas box. You'll see that there. That's a giveaway, because at the time that Irving was writing, a Christmas box meant something like a modern piggy bank, an earthenware container into which the rich were expected to put coins. Rattling the box meant begging that it be filled. Very common kind of ritual, and Irving actually reports it without talking about the meaning of it. As I've indicated, these performances contain the potential for ugly behavior. Nevertheless, in what I'll call the pre-modern culture in which they took place, even when things ended badly in actual violence, the inversion ritual, I would argue, and so would other historians, the inversion ritual did not really challenge the fundamental authority of the gentry class. Actually, it operated within the basic social order, even though sometimes at its very boundaries. And it's possible that the inversion ritual actually also functioned as a kind of safety valve that helped contain class resentments within seasonally defined limits. And even possible that by inverting the social hierarchy rather than simply ignoring it, the ritual ultimately served to reaffirm the normal social order that for that season it challenged or reversed. But all that held true only as long as the rich and poor lived in the same neighborhood so that they would be well known to each other. The gentry would regard them in a common phrase as my poor, my peasants, rather than the poor. And that was changing fast, that living near each other and knowing each other, that was changing fast in the decades leading up to 1820, a period of rapid urban growth and expanding capitalism, a period that saw the rich move into their own wealthy new neighborhoods, the origins of residential segregation by class, really a new thing at this time. In consequence, the known poor, my poor, were becoming an anonymous mass. The lower orders were becoming gradually transformed into a proletariat. And in the process, ritual social inversion gradually metamorphosed into incipient class struggle. Next slide, please. This is an illustration of a Christmas mob riot in the year 1806 in New York. We'll keep it for the rest of the talk here. Let me sum up this change with a single vivid example of the transition from the one earlier form to the newer one. It's an example that reveals that transition, I believe, in its very process, showing the change from an earlier rural form of social inversion to an emerging urban one. It comes from late 18th century Boston. The ritual was recorded later in his life, probably in the 1830s, by a very wealthy Boston gentleman who had been a child in the early 1780s when he observed it taking place. The gentleman's name was Samuel Breck. And what he recalled were a series of literal home invasions at Christmas. The invaders, in Breck's words, were, quote, a set of the lowest blackguards, disguised in filthy clothes and oftentimes with masked faces, going from house to house in large companies, obtruding themselves everywhere, particularly into the rooms occupied by parties of ladies and gentlemen of the upper classes. I have seen them at my father's house when his assembled friends were playing cards. Playing cards was another common Christmas ritual for the upper classes. I have seen them take possession of a table in the room, seat themselves on rich furniture, and proceed to handle the cards, to the great annoyance of the company. The only way to get rid of them was to give them money after they made a little dramatic performance. And even after the invaders finally left, the ordeal was still not over because, as Breck put it, the house would soon be filled with another gang. Breck then went on to explain why in the world his father, along with other wealthy Bostonians, would ever have put up with such invasions in the first place. His explanation was historical and very interesting, I think. He says, it was custom that had licensed these vagabonds. Custom licensed these vagabonds to enter by force any place they chose. And noting the degree to which custom had changed between the 1780s, when these rituals were taking place, and the 1830s, when he's recording them, Breck added rhetorically, what should we say to such intruders now? And answering his own question, he concluded, our manners would not brook such usage for a moment. Back finally to Washington Irving. Given the historical context I've been laying out of his account of Christmas in Bracebridge Hall, I suggested at the beginning of this talk that Irving's idealized account was deeply misleading, that his representation passed over the class tensions at Christmas time that his readers would surely have known were in play by 1820. That much is true, but a closer reading of the Bracebridge Hall sketches reveals that its author was trying subtly to have it both ways. He was not only attempting to present an idealized account that could touch a sweet nerve in his readers, this old-fashioned, lovely scene, but he was simultaneously offering his readers the evidence, if they chose to notice it or were able to notice it, that he himself understood how misleading his own idealized account really was. Irving takes pains to let his readers in on his understanding. He makes it clear, as I've said, that Squire Bracebridge's celebration was literally more than a reenactment. And his account of the celebration is larded with terms that serve to distance the author from the scene, terms such as odd and obsolete, quaint, even occasionally eccentric. And that's just the beginning. Irving actually indulges in some historical speculation, first putting his words in a little bit like Samuel Breck's the historical speculation. He puts his words to begin with in the voice of Squire Bracebridge. For example, as the squire is driving home from church just before his great dinner party, he, Squire Bracebridge, engages in a bit of nostalgic commentary. He starts by lamenting, and I quote, the deplorable decay of the games and amusements which were once prevalent at this season among the lower orders and countenanced by the higher, licensed as or by the higher. When the old halls of castles and manor houses were thrown open at daylight, and when the rich and the poor were alike welcome to enter and make merry. The squire, Irving's voice of the squire, goes on, and as he does so, his nostalgia spills into a confession that he himself has been finally incapable of recreating the genuine rituals of Christmas past, the ideal Christmas ritual. And at precisely this moment, the squire moves from antiquarianism into political theory, into Tory political theory. He writes, or he says, according to Irving's narrator, the nation is altered now. We have almost lost our simple, true-hearted peasantry. They have broken asunder from the higher classes, and they seem to think that their interests are separate. They have become too knowing, and they begin to read newspapers, to listen to alehouse politicians, and to talk of reform, shades of Fanny Wright. I think one mode to keep them in good humor in these hard times would be for the nobility and gentry to pass more time on their estates, to mingle more among the country people and set the merry old English games going again. Surely, Irving was expressing here his own distaste for both democracy and capitalism, a distaste he made clear in his other writings as well, even in Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In any case, at this point, Irving's own narrative voice breaks in and takes over for the squire. Such, he writes, such was the good squire's project for mitigating public discontent. And indeed, he had once attempted to put his doctrine into practice. And a few years before, he had kept open house during the holidays in the old style. In other words, Squire Bracebridge had tried letting any and all of the local peasants and villagers into his home. But that open house experiment turned out a failure, and Irving tells us how. The country people, when they were all let in the old style, the country people did not understand how to play their parts in the scene of hospitality. In fact, many uncouth circumstances occurred, which Irving, not surprisingly, does not choose to name. And in fact, the manor, he goes on, the manor was overrun by all the vagrants of the country, and more beggars were drawn into the neighborhood in 1 week than the parish officers could get rid of in 1 year. So Squire Bracebridge was forced to back off his original project. Nowadays, Irving tells us, his aim was more modest. He, quote, contented himself with inviting the decent part of the neighboring peasantry to the hall at Christmas Day. And it's that select group, not the entire neighborhood that comes to Bracebridge Hall. And by the way, they came at the stipulated time. They came and were allowed to entertain and mingle with the squire's real guests, the scene with which I began by showing Irving's idealized description. But in a final stroke of ironic distancing, Irving lets us, his readers, in on a secret that he says Squire Bracebridge himself has failed to observe. For as the squire mingled among the rustics, and quoting here, and received from them awkward demonstrations of deference and regard. Awkward? Irving's narrator reports for us this little vignette. Quote, I perceived 2 or 3 of the younger peasants as they were raising their tankards of ale to their mouths, and when the squire's back was turned, making something of a grimace and giving each other the wink. But the moment they caught my eye, they pulled grave faces and were exceedingly demure. In the end then, and despite all the precautions he had taken to do the job right, Squire Bracebridge had been unable to keep even the decent part of the local peasantry in good humor on Christmas Day. By thus subverting, and I'm concluding here, by thus subverting his own nostalgic idealization, Washington Irving was tacitly acknowledging that by 1820, it may have been impossible for real life gentlemen to make even the most carefully wrought social inversion ritual work out as hoped. To do that job would require a deeper, more profound alteration of the old ritual. As it happened, just such an alteration would be devised only 2 years later. In 1822, Irving's New York City colleague and friend, Clement Clark Moore, composed what would become the best known and most enduring poem in all American literature, The Night Before Christmas, as we know it. What old Squire Bracebridge was unable to accomplish would be done by another personage who offered bountiful Christmas largesse, that is, of course, Santa Claus. It's a fascinating story, but one whose telling, I'm afraid, must wait upon another occasion. And for that, I thank you.